So this video is going to give you a little bit of guidance about how to approach reading a scientific paper. So the advice is particularly targeted for undergraduates or for readers who are reading scientific papers for the first time. So the advice I'm going to give comes both from my own experience of reading papers, of teaching students how to read papers, but also from some research work that I've done on this very topic. So let's think about what we mean by a scientific paper. Well, there are actually two types of scientific paper that you might encounter in your reading. So the first would be an original research paper. So I've given an example of a paper that I've published. So this was published in Nature. And this is a paper, it's an original research paper that presents original research data. So we did a bunch of experiments, we've drawn the graphs, we've done the statistical analysis, and then we're presenting these in a paper so that other scientists can read them and have a look at our findings. So this is presenting research data that has never been published before, so new experiments. So in these sorts of papers, you would expect to see quite a lot of tables or graphs in the middle of the paper, and they're written in quite a structured form that we'll discuss later. There are also scientific review papers. So again, this is one from my publication history. So a review paper is much more essay format, and what a review paper is doing is to synthesise all of the most recent studies on a particular topic, to kind of bring all of that research together, bring out the emerging themes, to maybe propose a model for how it works, so to kind of gather all of that knowledge together. So here you can see this is a review paper, it's much more essay style, it's all about the synthesis of knowledge, and for example we put in some conceptual models of how things work. So this isn't original research data, this is more of models and cartoons of how the biology might work. So when you're reading, you want to be really clear first of all, am I reading an original research paper or am I reading a review paper? So it might be that on your course you've been given a paper to read, or it might be that you've been asked to go away and do a literature search for yourself, and then you've got to choose what to read. So you might go to a search engine, so Web of Science or Google Scholar, and do a search, and then you get a whole bunch of papers coming up. And choosing which paper to read can be quite tricky. So these are the sorts of things that I would be thinking about when I'm choosing a paper. The first one is, well, are you looking for a research paper or are you looking for a review? If it's a new topic that you don't really understand very much about, going straight to an original research paper might be a bit much. So I would go for a review paper if it was a topic that I didn't understand very well or didn't know very much about. And certainly in Web of Science, you can structure your search so you can say, I only want to be looking for review articles, and that can help your searching quite a lot. The next thing I'll be asking is, from the title, is it clearly related to the topic that you're studying? You don't have time to read all of the papers that Web of Science suggests, so I would be really selective. I'm looking at topic X, and if the paper doesn't really clearly relate to topic X, then I'd ignore it and I'd find a paper that was much more obviously relevant. One test I use for how difficult or easy is it going to be to read the paper is to just read the abstract. The abstract is the summary at the beginning of the paper, and you'll find that some scientists are very good at writing and some scientists are appalling at writing. If I'm struggling to understand the abstract, if I read the abstract and I still don't understand what's going on, the chances of me understanding the whole paper are virtually nil. So I would look at the abstract. If the abstract seemed relatively accessible, then the paper is more likely to be one that you can read. If you're looking at a primary paper, I would look for papers that use techniques that you already know about. It will make it a lot easier. So, for example, if you don't know anything about qPCR and how qPCR works, trying to read a qPCR paper is going to be difficult because you've got the biology that's going on and you've got the techniques that are going on. So I would try and read papers that use techniques that you're already familiar with if you can. And the other thing I would look for is the figures. So are they easy to understand? So some papers are nice. They've got box plots, bar charts, scatter plots, maybe an evolutionary tree. Those sorts of figures tend to be reasonably easy to interpret, but some of them have really complicated figures. There might be heat maps of transcriptomic data, or they might just be hideously complicated. As an undergraduate, I would pick papers that the graphs were relatively easy to understand, and therefore it's more likely that you'll be able to know what's going on. So, we've chosen a research paper to have a look at. We need to think a little bit about its structure. And as I say, there's a very characteristic structure that these papers have. And there are generally 6 parts of the paper. So the first is the abstract, there's then an introduction, methods, results, discussion, and the references at the end. Okay? So let's think about what each of those are. So the abstract gives a summary of the whole paper in about 300 words. And as I say, if you're finding the abstract difficult to read, you'll probably find the rest of the paper difficult to read. But if the abstract looks really relevant and really readable, then I would go further. The introduction is the scientific background, so it identifies a research question, addresses a gap in our current knowledge. So the authors will look at existing studies, they'll say, we know this, we know this, we know this, but we don't know this, and these are the experiments that we're going to do to address that gap. The methods will obviously be a detailed description of the protocols and materials used. That's likely to be quite dense and quite impenetrable. That's really written there for if someone wants to reproduce that experiment in the lab themselves. So you might find the methods quite tough going. The results, there's 2 bits. There's a written description of what happened, and then there's also graphs and tables to present that research data, plus the stats. And the results section, you need to look at both parts of that. You need to look at the text, but you do also need to look at the graphs and tables. The discussion is how the study authors are interpreting their results. So they'll compare their results to the rest of the literature, they might point out the limitations of their current study, or they might point out future research directions. And then at the end, obviously, you'll have the references. So that's all of the papers that the authors use as a background for their own study. So that can be quite useful if you're trying to find papers in a particular area. Well, if you found one paper that looks relevant, then going to the reference section of that paper can be quite helpful to you. They're usually presented in that order, but some journals present them in a slightly different way. So sometimes the methods you'll find them at the end of the paper or even in a supplemental file. And some journals put the results and the discussion together, so they won't be separate subheadings, they'll all be lumped together. So reading research papers can be a bit challenging, and I think it's really important to remember that research papers are how experts communicate with each other. These are scientists writing to other scientists. So as an undergraduate, you're not a professional scientist. It's okay to find this quite challenging. Scientific text is often quite complicated, and there's lots of jargon in there. There might be lots of abbreviations. That can be quite intimidating. And often undergraduates find reading research papers frustrating. But what I think is important to realise is, so we did a study of both undergraduates and scientists and asked them about their reading papers. And 42% of the professional researchers, so academics that we asked, agreed that reading papers is frustrating. Some papers are really tough going, and it's okay to find it frustrating. In our study, we also looked at which bits of papers people found difficult to read. So on this graph, we've got career stage along the bottom, so 2nd and 3rd year undergraduates going through PhDs and then into professional scientists. And then we've got the different sections of the paper and how easy to read are they. And you'll see that the undergraduates in particular find the methods and the results more difficult to read. So that's absolutely normal. If you think, oh gosh, this is hard work, you're not alone. That's very, very common. And particularly the methods undergraduates find difficult to read. But often methods are less relevant to an undergraduate. If you're not going to reproduce the experiment yourself, the methods might be less important. Okay, but it's normal to find this kind of frustrating. But I also asked my scientists what they tended to focus on. So how did they read a paper? So professional scientists tend to focus on the results, so the figures and the tables and the text, whereas undergraduates tended to focus more on the discussion, the abstract. So there's a bit of a change in how people read. So if a scientist is telling you how to read a paper, so an academic, what they probably mean is look at the results of this paper. So it's not just about reading the words. If they've said go and read a paper, they will understand that actually as going and looking at the results themselves. So I think if there's an important figure in the paper, one of the things you can do to help you understand it is to write a summary of that figure in your own words. So if there's a particular graph you think, yeah, that's really important, that will be directly relevant to my assignment or whatever it is you're doing, can you write a summary of that figure in your own words? If you can do that, then you've probably understood it. If you haven't, then you might want to look again. So I asked my professional scientists advice on how to read a paper for the first time. So this is just a word cloud that summarises their results, and you'll see that it's results and the figures that were really emphasised in there. That's what professional scientists think is most important in reading a paper. So before you're reading it, think to yourself, why am I reading this? What information do you want to get out of it? If you just read without a plan, then you can spend a lot of time reading stuff that's not really very relevant. So before you start reading, is this the right paper to read? Why am I reading it? What do I want to find out from it? You can be selective in what you read, so you can prioritise the sections of the paper. So if you're just trying to get background information, you might just read the introduction. You might not need to go into the results and the methods. But if you're trying to find a particular piece of evidence to back up what you're saying in an assignment, then it might be that the figures are what you really want to do. So be selective. You don't have to read the entire paper, and you don't have to read it in the order in which it's presented. Don't get bogged down in the technical terminology. In papers that I read, even in my specialist subject, there will be words I do not know the meaning of that word. And in some ways it doesn't really matter. I wouldn't spend lots of time looking up every individual word. What does that mean? All of that. I would focus on the overall ideas. I think if a word is in the abstract that you don't know, look up that word, because that's likely to come up multiple times in the paper. But every last acronym or technical term, I really wouldn't worry about it. Think about the big picture instead. Read it multiple times and take your time. You're not likely to get much out of a paper if you just skim read it. So take your time. If it's a paper you think, yes, this is really relevant, take a little bit of time, read it multiple times, go backwards and forwards. It's okay. It's better probably to read a smaller number of papers, but to read them in more depth than trying to read lots of papers at a very superficial level. And there will be the abstract of the paper, but I would write your own abstract of a paper. Can you summarise the whole paper in 300 words? So what was their question? What did they do? What were their findings? If you can do that, then you've probably understood the paper. So I think that's a really useful thing that you can do. And the other thing that I would do is to read with other people. So as professional scientists, we have journal clubs. So we get together as a research group and we'd read a particular paper together, try and work out what the figures mean, what do these results mean, how have they done their analysis, all of that sort of thing. We read collaboratively quite a lot as scientists. So you don't have to read on your own in the library. Get together with a couple of people from your course, read the same paper and then come and discuss it. Did you understand what was going on there? Can you interpret figure 4? Oh, that's what was going on. If you read collaboratively, you're more likely to have success in understanding it. So I hope this advice has been helpful. I've highlighted a couple of resources that might help you further. So the ASPB, that's the American Society for Plant Biology, have put together a really excellent guide on how to read a scientific paper. So that's well worth checking out. And then also there's an article in Science called How to Seriously Read a Scientific Paper. It was published in 2016, and that has loads of recommendations for reading papers from other professional scientists. So I hope this has been useful for you in understanding what to look at in papers. It is challenging, it can be frustrating, and sometimes even I give up on a paper of like, this is just too much hard work, I don't have the time to understand all of the ins and outs of it. But hopefully if you've got a plan, you've picked out the right paper and you know what you're looking for, that will help you in understanding scientific papers.